So using something like a really basic vibrator can be great because it increases the intensity of the sensations that you're feeling. Sex is so wrapped up in how we feel about our relationships or how we feel about being desired. I believe that less people would need to come to psychosexual therapy if we had better, everyday, normalised conversations.
Welcome to End the Dry Spell, a conversation with leading women's health experts about intimate dryness. I'm Fiona Toomey, the founder of the skincare and wellness brand NAYDAYA. And we're calling on the nation to end the dry spell of awareness and put an end to the stigma around intimate dryness. And we're here to bring matters of moisture into the mainstream. And we really think by normalising discussions about intimate dryness, we believe we can increase its visibility on the women's health agenda. We surveyed over 2,000 women and we got some really interesting results. 83% of women said they experienced intimate dryness at some point in their lives. And nearly 70% of you who suffered from intimate dryness said it affected their sexual relationships. Today we have the amazing Kate Moyle, and just so our viewers know who she is, she's a registered psychosexual relationship therapist and a certified psychosexologist. So today we have Kate Moyle, the renowned psychosexual therapist. She's also an author and a podcaster. So we are so excited to have the conversation today around this. So please introduce yourself.
You've just done such a good job for me. I am a therapist who specialises in talking about sexual and relationship problems. So psychosexual therapy is this kind of niche corner of psychotherapy. And then the rest of my work basically revolves around taking those conversations out into the mainstream, because I believe that less people would need to come to psychosexual therapy if we had better, everyday, normalised conversations. So I often talk about how, ironically, I'm always trying to do myself out of a job.
And tell me about your book. When did that launch?
So that was published last September, and it's gone out in a couple of countries, and it's a psychosexual kind of education, so a re-education really, because so many of us didn't get the right education first time round. And it answers over 100 of the most asked questions about sex from a biological perspective, a psychological perspective, a social perspective. And it has amazing illustrations, anatomy diagrams, and really is this kind of comprehensive sex education guide.
So how did you get into this role? It's not every day I meet people in this line of work.
I've always, even as a child, kind of been fascinated with psychology and like what makes people tick. And I think it just really, originally it developed as a kind of academic interest. And then I went into psychosexual therapy and then my relationship therapy training, and it has just snowballed from there. But I've always wondered why the word sex kind of made people like change their body position or kind of look away, or and I think I've just always been someone that's not really found it difficult to ask questions, and it kind of spiraled from there, and here we are. But yeah, I think it was I'm pretty sure it's not every parent's dream for their kind of child in their 20s to say, I think I want to be a psychosexual therapist, but they're very supportive.
Yeah, but it's interesting, like the education I find, even now, I feel like the only education we're getting is like the movies, porn. Like it's not, we get a very limited amount in school. So I feel like our idea of sex is probably completely wrong. Is it?
Well, so many of us, so much of our learning about sex is social. So it comes from the media and the world around us and what people say and what we hear, and then what we kind of intimate from that, or what the assumptions are, and the kind of ideas that we then develop from there. So yeah, everything really kind of shapes our ideas about sex. And we find it very difficult to talk about sex even in 2024. And so, of course, accessing information without having to ask anyone or without having to talk about it feels like the easiest route. And sex education, kind of in its formal sense, is not really adequate enough to set us up for the nuances of sex. And we still live in this, I was asked recently, is our sexual culture broken? And I said, not like broken necessarily, but definitely faulty. And I think that when we kind of exist in that context, then sex still remains this kind of tricky, taboo, kind of awkward subject, which is why so many people struggle with it, unsurprisingly.
And what kind of issues and problems do women face when they come and visit you in your clinic?
So one of the kind of main ones is desire. So often people report feeling that they've lost desire. Often it's actually that desire has changed. But again, how we are taught or think about desire in itself sets a lot of us up to feel like it's problematic, that the change is problematic, when we know that actually it's the most normal thing to expect. I work with a lot of women with sexual pain, so whether that's because of hormonal changes or postnatal, or because of an operation or menopause or cancer, or conditions like vulvodynia or vaginismus. So those kind of pain conditions, endometriosis, are a big part of my work, because obviously it changes our relationship to sex if it's no longer something, or was never something, that was fun, enjoyable, pleasurable, but actually is something that makes us feel pain, anxiety, or would rather avoid it. And so working with that. And then I think a lot of it is about like how couples navigate their lives and relationships. And so I work with lots of couples who might be going through different phases or stages, or experiencing things like infertility, or are trying to kind of rework their sex lives after something, or even if it's just a period of time, or just that they kind of feel like they want to get back on a path of enjoying sex a bit more.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about different stages, because I think like sex changes, from the time you start having it till, right into it. So are there different stages in women's lives that like there's big dramatic changes, and do you see more issues around different stages?
God, there are so many. I mean, almost an unlimited number of, whether we call them stages, phases, but yeah, absolutely. When it comes to sex, we know that kind of big hormonal changes, obviously, our kind of hormones are with us, well, from before birth, but kind of the whole way through our lives. We see kind of big changes around puberty, so the kind of start of our fertile lives, and obviously menopause, so kind of the closing of our fertility. But, that's not just these two kind of nice, succinct, like neat stages, as we know. There's obviously perimenopause, pregnancy, postnatally, and all associated with hormonal changes, but social, psychological changes, identity changes. We can't separate all of those.
So when talking about vulva and vaginal health, what kind of issues do you find pop up for women?
Well, the first one being that so often people use the term vagina when they mean vulva, and this is something we've seen consistently across pieces like the Eva Peel's research, that so many women struggle to correctly label their anatomy, on a diagram. And it's not anyone's fault, but it's just to do with the fact that we just, historically haven't even used the word vulva.
No.
And that sets us up to fail. So if we go to our doctor and we're saying, I'm experiencing pain in my vagina, and that's not what we mean, our doctor can only understand kind of what we're saying based on what we're saying as well. So that is one of the big ones when we kind of have this conversation. But some people might be experiencing kind of repeated infections in terms of vaginal kind of yeast infections, or irritation, kind of ongoing pain or burning. So the vagina is pH balanced, and so we know that obviously anything can kind of interfere with that. And then kind of vulval, a lot of anxiety around like what our bodies look like genital anxiety. I think a lot of fear about like, am I normal? I think is such a big question in my work. But things like pain, sensitivity, and particularly around things like orgasm.
So how do you think we can lift the taboo around vulva and vaginal conditions?
I mean, the first thing I think is talking about it, isn't it? Yeah. I think, we don't have these normalising kind of mainstream conversations. And I think we also we still kind of like whisper the word vagina sometimes. And I think teaching from early on that this is not something to be ashamed of. So also like teaching kind of young people like these are the correct terminology for your bodies, but also that if you have a problem that you should kind of go and speak to a medical professional about it. And there's something about knowing you're normal. So this idea of normal is really, really pervasive. And what it doesn't do is it doesn't set us up to know our normal. And then if we know our normal, then we can identify changes that might happen. Whereas instead, if we're comparing ourselves to a version of what we think normal is, we become more preoccupied with that than actually what's going on for us in our bodies. But for me, it's fairly straightforward. It's kind of having conversations, having accurate information which is available to people, whether it's through, brands or through kind of social media or through websites. And then it's about kind of encouraging people to do something about it and not feeling limited by shame or embarrassment.
Yeah, I was, my son who's 8 brought home a picture of a woman's anatomy, and I was so happy that like vulva was written there, because that just was not there when I was learning the anatomy of a woman. Like I feel like it's a much more recent thing to properly label it. So I was very happy that like my 8-year-old knows the full anatomy of a woman, which is great. So we conducted a survey of over 2,000 women, and one of the findings we found was that nearly 70% of women who suffer with intimate dryness say it really affected their sexual relationship. So do you see this, or how does this affect women?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, it's just not a surprise, because intimate dryness is often associated with discomfort or itching or pain. And obviously, if we are feeling like that's going on, then sex, which involves that part of our body, is going to be something we feel a bit more fearful of, or a bit more anxious about, a bit more stressed about. We might be concerned that it might feel or be experienced differently for our partners, and it's going to cause a level of distraction, which is really bad for our sex lives. Distraction is a real negative for our desire and our arousal. And I think that for me, then that association between, this is something uncomfortable or something that might be painful, is going to mean that we're going to experience an interruption to desire, or perhaps we're not going to feel quite as open to sex as we usually do. So I think that it wouldn't be a surprise to me at all. But also vaginal dryness or vaginal atrophy can cause sex to become painful or uncomfortable, because the tissue is not as lubricated, and therefore it can cause friction, and friction is not a great thing.
No, and I know from personal experience that is just, it can really just put you off. I mean, I've suffered from intimate dryness at different stages, like after having a baby, entering perimenopause, and I think, and it becomes, you get anxious. I get anxious about sex, because I'm like, am I going to get cut? Am I going to bleed? I mean, it does just cause a lot of anxiety, I think.
Yeah, and some people do experience like kind of small tearing or small bleeding, and it's really uncomfortable. And of course, if that happens, you're going to then be fearful of it happening the next time you go into that experience, and so it can create this really vicious cycle of worrying. And then if we're worried, we might be more tense, which can make things more uncomfortable, which can make things painful. We might be less aroused, so we might be less lubricated, and then that can make sex more uncomfortable. And so we see this kind of real cycle when it goes on with things like this.
Do you find women discuss these problems with their partners, or are they siloed?
No, I don't think that women discuss it at all, because I think also there's this really underlying kind of very well established narrative, which is that if you're not wet, you're not turned on, and that must be a problem. And so we still see this with people using lubricant, that there's a real kind of difficulty, or like, but I don't need that, or why would, I shouldn't be someone that needs that, or no, I'm really attracted to my partner, I don't need that. And that is quite a lot of the underlying message. Whereas actually what we're saying is this is something which is affected by arousal, stress levels, hormone changes, what day of the week it is, and that shouldn't be a barrier to you having more comfortable and therefore more enjoyable sex. And using lubricant is like a perfect example, and a very easy way to make life better in terms of that. But we still see those kind of niggling worries and anxieties which stop people using them, or stop people kind of feeling like they have to express a need to use them, or talking to their partners about it.
So how is sex related to our mental health and our general well-being?
We describe what we have as a bi-directional relationship between our sexual well-being and our mental health, which, is a fancy word for saying it exists like everything else in life, which is that it can have an effect on our mental health, and our mental health can have an effect on our sexual well-being. So we understand that sex is in context. So if we've had a really miserable day, or we're feeling really stressed, or we're feeling really physically tired, or we are struggling with intimate dryness, or whatever it is, we can't escape how we think about what's happening to us physically, and we can't really escape what's happening to us physically and kind of take it out of our thinking. So all of those things are happening all the time, and we know that often when people are struggling with their mental health, that distraction is high, that they might be struggling to kind of be in the moment, that they might be kind of being quite self-critical. So all of those things will be playing a part, which are not really things that make us feel relaxed, comfortable, desire, kind of feeling turned on. And if we are worrying about sex, that can have an impact on our self-esteem, our self-confidence. We might be worried about like what it means that we're someone that this is happening to, or what does it mean for our relationship. That can create more stress and anxiety, and that again can kind of then circle back round into sex.
And then if we talk about the different stages, because obviously when you've had a baby, I think sex after that is quite a big thing. You know, it can be hard to go, it's not the same. You know, you can feel differently at different stages. How do you advise women to, like, I don't know, just loosen up and just get in the moment? Because, you know, you've got so many other distractions now that you've had a baby.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah.
An unlimited amount. I think one of the things is, so it's not recommended in the UK that people attempt to have or kind of go back to having intercourse or penetrative sex until 6 weeks postnatally. So that's the kind of recommended guidance, and that's whether you've had a vaginal delivery or a C-section. But I think it's an ironic term, but baby steps back into physical intimacy is a really good thing to kind of think about, because you might not feel ready. It depends on what birth you've had. Some people, you know, a huge amount of people have had traumatic births. You might be feeling kind of unsure or uncomfortable what happened during the birth. You might have been struggling with feeding. You might have had stitches, an episiotomy, tearing. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But it's unlikely that you haven't had some feeling about what your body's been through during that time, which is going to change like how relaxed and how comfortable you feel. And I think that for one thing, kind of establishing a space where you can have some level of physical intimacy and get comfortable with each other again can help you to relax into it. And then it might be that, you know, intercourse or penetrative sex, if that's what we are saying when we mean the word sex, is something that happens after you guys have had a chance to just connect again as a couple, because we know that you are completely time poor, sleep poor, that it's likely that there's huge piles of washing, covering in baby poo and milk sick and all of the things that we have to contend with, and that generally you're not really going to have much headspace to even think about your sexual self or your desire at that point. And so you might need to intentionally create a bit of space when you feel ready, just even if it's 20 minutes to be together, not to have the pressure to have sex, but just to connect.
Yeah. I'm all up for scheduling sex. I think it's great. But it's interesting just around the traumatic birth. I had a very traumatic birth with my first and episiotomy, and I was so eager to have sex again, because I was like, I just need to know that I can do it. And I was like pretty traumatized after the first time, because I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready emotionally. I wasn't ready physically. And then like it did cause quite a lot of anxiety, you know, and then even the next time I was even more anxious. And it's really hard to kind of know when the time is right, I suppose. But maybe, as you said, kind of, you know, spending time together, getting into the zone is the right thing to do.
But I think sex is so wrapped up in how we feel about our relationships, or how we feel about being desired. You know, are we desirable? Do our partners still desire us? Do we still desire them? And it's not just the act of sex, it's everything that it means to us. And often if we're feeling, you know, we might be kind of really in the depths of that new parent thing, but actually not feeling very connected as a couple, as a family perhaps, or as a couple. If that's what we're seeking, we can do that in ways that don't require something that currently feels stressful, like sex. And it's about working out how to do that for you so that you feel ready again. And only you will know when you feel ready. And if that's going on and you're really struggling, then that might be the point at which to seek some further guidance, or to go back to your GP, or to, you know, ask a psychosexual for a psychosexual referral or something like that. But there are also so many great resources now, great books, podcasts, content that I think can act as a really good first step to you just also realising that this is going on for a lot of other people. Because when we feel really alone in our experience, that massively rockets our anxiety.
So midlife can radically change just the landscape of sex. So can you elaborate on this?
So particularly when we're kind of perimenopausal, so we're not in menopause, which is where we've had 12 months without a period, but estrogen is starting to decline. We might be noticing some of the symptoms. But when we think about the common symptoms associated with menopause, there are over 30. And they are not just affecting kind of physically what's going on for you, but how you are thinking, how you're feeling. A lot of women are reporting kind of brain fog, feeling like they're kind of cognitively really struggling. And that might be something that's never happened for them before in their lives. They might be top of their game at that time. And then there's, I think, a lot going on for people around identity. But the physical changes, if we're experiencing something like vaginal dryness and that causes uncomfortable sex, and that also might be the first time that's ever happened to us, or something that hasn't happened kind of regularly as a part of our sex lives, and we don't associate it with perimenopause, we might not realise we're perimenopausal at that point, we can be really confused. And then the anxiety that we can feel about that, or the confusion, can mean that the next time we go to have a sexual experience, we're thinking, well, last time that happened, is that going to happen again? Because now I'm a bit worried about that, and I don't have an explanation for it. That can put us in much more of a kind of stress response rather than a kind of sexual arousal response, which again is likely to add a layer to the fact that it might become more of a difficulty. But I think that there's so much going on around that time, and it's so what we describe as biopsychosocial. So it's not just physically and biologically what's happening, but it's how we think and feel about it, and it's also the social part, like what we think that means as a person in society, or what we think that means about us, and then how we feel. And it's such a big kind of period of change.
And then someone who's like suffering from intimate dryness, like how can they improve their sexual relationships?
So one thing is finding something that helps you. So whether it's a really good water-based lubricant, and I would say if you are experiencing intimate dryness, don't use any products that are scented, flavoured, could cause irritation, anything like that, because if you're already experiencing some discomfort, we don't want to layer anything onto that could make it worse. So finding something that works for you, whether it's something like a good water-based lubricant, and it might be about increasing sensitivity. So using something like a really basic vibrator can be great because it increases the intensity of the sensations that you're feeling, and that could be used like all over the body and in a really playful way with partners. But it's also about remembering that sex might need to be adapted based on the changes of what's happening to you, because it's not this static fixed part of our lives, and we're constantly adapting every other part of our lives, but for some reason we don't have that conversation around sex. And also communicating to your partner, if you have one, saying, do you know what, this was feeling really good for me 6 months ago, but it isn't at the moment. Can we try something different, or can we do something differently? I don't know why, or there's obviously something going on, but I want to be enjoying this, and I don't want to be just kind of carrying on with you not knowing how I'm feeling. And most partners will be like, of course I don't want you to be doing anything that's uncomfortable, so let's work it out. And I think that's the third bit, because your partner can't know what's going on for you unless you tell them.
And do you recommend any sexual positions for women that are going through dryness, or is it just what feels comfortable?
Whatever feels comfortable, because it's going to be so different based on you, based on your partner, based on the context, the setting, the day of the week. And I think that if it's uncomfortable, don't just kind of push on with it and carry on, because what you're doing is you're reinforcing that sex is something uncomfortable and painful, and what we want you to do is to be focusing on what feels good. So Emily Nagoski, who is an absolute icon in our world, uses this phrase, which is pleasure is the measure, and it's just so good for framing what the experiences can be like. And it requires no particular kind of moves or body parts in certain places, or stipulates a plan, but it's just do what feels good and what feels good for you. And I think that it's a good thing that we can all be reminded of, because we're so often subscribing to this model of sex and doing what we think we should be doing, rather than actually the reason that most of us are having sex, which is for fun, connection, and to enjoy it.
And do we need sex? Is it, I don't know, do we need it?
if we need it, if we're someone that needs it, or a relationship that needs it, but some don't. And again, if we're in a relationship with a partner, then it's about what works for all of the people in that relationship, or both partners, and that it's about kind of balancing and negotiating those needs. But for some people, maybe not.
So what would be your top 2 or 3 tips for somebody who's been affected by intimate dryness?
So one is, don't panic and think there's nothing you can do about it, I think. So many of us assume that sex changing must be a bad thing, or that something changing must be a bad thing, and that's just a roadblock, kind of, end of the road. I think find something that helps you, that makes you feel good. So whether that's, a product or a lubricant or anything that helps you. And sometimes you might have to kind of work out, try a few things, but you shouldn't have to settle for it being uncomfortable and painful. Like, just because painful sex is common does not mean that it's normal. I think another thing is working out what helps you to feel desire. So we often talk about these kind of good conditions for sex. So they are a triangle of kind of being present and in the moment, being psychologically turned on, but also being physically turned on. And we all want our good conditions to be met. So working out what it is for you that helps you to feel in that place. And that could be something simple as changing the lighting, or kind of being off your phone for half an hour before bed, which gives you a little bit more time to kind of get in the mood, or listening to some audio erotica, or, using a vibrator, which kind of dials up the intensity, and using it playfully with your partner to kind of incorporate into a massage or whatever it is. And I think the third thing is finding some information or education that helps you to feel like you're not the only one struggling with this. Because for me, one of the biggest side effects of struggles with this part of our lives is that we then think we're the only ones. We're not seeing the conversation happening. And that causes so much more stress than it needs to, and is just also completely wrong. We know that there are so many people struggling. It's just that the conversation isn't happening at the same rate as, the volume of people struggling with it.
I think that's such a good point, because I think a lot of the times we don't know that other women are experiencing these types of issues. And when we started the brand, we started with a whole load of products, but it's become so much more. It's a community, it's a safe space, and we get hundreds of emails and questions on social media. So I think part of the reason we have set this up is really to give women just more education in a digestible format, so they can come and listen to amazing people like you and really just get the right education and the right information, and just know that they're not alone.
And I think the thing is, it's about the right kind of information also. There's so much information, but also I think people fear seeking this kind of information out because they don't know where to find it or the right place to find it. And we know in our worlds that this stuff is happening all the time, but the general population perhaps don't. And so that's such a big part of the problem in itself.
And how do people come see you? Do they come directly to you? Do they get referred by GPs? Or like, at what stage in the kind of like medical sphere do people come see you?
So a lot of people self-refer, but I also get referrals from gynecologists, from urologists, pelvic health physiotherapists, GPs. A lot of people come to me through things like my podcast, but really it's, in numerous ways, but mostly it's people kind of directing themselves my way.
Thank you so much, Kate. Really enjoyed having you on today. And I know our viewers will just really, really appreciate this topic, because it's not every day we get to talk about sex. I mean, I would talk about it every day, and I'm sure you would too. But thank you so much for coming. Really enjoyed having you. And if you want to hear any more about our campaign, it's on our website, and it's called End the Dry Spell.